Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie, or more formally, Shadow Freddy and RWQFSFASXC. What the hell are these guys? This has been a thorn in my side for a long time. Like, it started as just a cool Easter egg, and then suddenly they were incredibly important to the plot, and then they disappeared forever, and now Shadow Bonnie's back again in special delivery. They're important, but what are they? Well, that's what we're going to try and figure out today. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. Speaking of putting on aprons, we still have some more in stock. Thank you so much for the people who ordered them. Link down below, thank you. First, let's gather our ingredients. We're going to need every single bit of information on these guys if we're going to figure out anything. Starting with their first appearances in FNAF 2, they were both sort of just cool Easter eggs. Shadow Bonnie would appear in your office with 1,000,000 to 1 odds. Flash it away with a flashlight, or it would crash your game. No jump scare though. Similarly, Shadow Freddy would rarely appear in the parts and service screen. You would just have to tab away from him to make him go away, but if you didn't, he would also crash your game. Again, no jump scare. It is important to note though that while Shadow Bonnie is pure black, Vanta black actually, if you brighten the image on Shadow Freddy, he's actually a dark purple. Not sure if it's important, but it is noteworthy. Now let's move on to a meteor game entry, FNAF 3. These guys are actually super important for the plot here, so let's dig deep. The only during gameplay Easter egg of either of them really comes in the form of Shadow Freddy, who can very rarely appear in the very left side of your office. Granted, he doesn't do anything, he's just kind of there, but it's important to note. However, in the in-between night minigames, he's a leading role. The minigames are called Follow Me, in which we follow Shadow Freddy throughout the FNAF 1 location as one of the FNAF 1 animatronics. Each time we follow him for a while, typically ending in this room where we get disassembled by William Afton. But the Freddy files do specify that they're positive. Quote, they help the children. In the night end minigames, Shadow Freddy tries to lead you to the killer who's hiding out in the safe room. So that's worth mentioning. Shadow Bonnie doesn't actually appear in-game at all. Now there are Easter eggs that reference Shadow Bonnie, specifically the paper plate pal and the figure on the desk, but Shadow Bonnie itself doesn't appear. However, in the Happiest Day minigames, you play as Shadow Bonnie, specifically in the second to last one where you glitch through every previous minigame to eventually give cake to a crying child. This feels super important, but I have no idea why it does this. The Freddy files also point this out as positive. Quote, Shadow Bonnie gives cake to one of the children, which seems benevolent. Wait a minute. One of the children? These aren't all just the same child? There's multiple crying children in these games? I'm gonna put a pin in that because that's for another day. Now, do these guys appear anywhere else? Well, their next appearance chronologically in release would be FNAF World, where they're both playable characters. Shadow Freddy's loading screen quote is, I will eat your soul, which is a little intense, but Shadow Bonnie's quote is, say my name, which is kind of like a silly reference to the fact that his name is RXQFSF. Shadow Freddy has 3 attacks: unscrew, escape key, and water hose. On the other hand, Shadow Bonnie's 3 attacks are haunting, mimic ball, and gift boxes. It's worth noting that Shadow Freddy's attacks are all one-hit KO moves, being incredibly aggressive, whereas Shadow Bonnie's attacks are summoning something, and healing the team. So they definitely seem like offensive and defensive counterparts of one another. The next appearance chronologically could be argued to be Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator. Now, granted, I don't myself believe in this one, but it's mentioned a lot in the community, so it's worth mentioning here. Some people argue that these glitches at the very beginning of the game are Shadow Freddy. I don't think it holds water because 1, it's gray, not purple or black, and 2, it kind of just looks like a glitchy version of your character. It could even be Lefty, but it doesn't look like Shadow Freddy to me. Regardless, I'll mention it here. Shadow Bonnie doesn't show up in this game at all. However, in Ultimate Custom Night, Shadow Bonnie is one of the animatronics that can be summoned by Dee. Granted, he doesn't really do anything to you. He just turns off all the lights in your office for 10 seconds. You can't stop him, and he'll just go away on his own. The next entry of these two is in Special Delivery, specifically Shadow Bonnie. One of the main side modes in Special Delivery is gathering Remnant. Anytime you gather Remnant, eventually Dark Remnant will show up. Collect enough of this, and Shadow Bonnie will appear, being aggressive towards the player. This all might be the game's version of Agony, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here. Essentially, in one of the most common side modes of this game, Shadow Bonnie is like the main antagonist, so a really big role actually, and it exists to stop the player from collecting Remnant. After Special Delivery, Well, the only other references we have of them are in this cardboard cutout of Shadow Bonnie in Help Wanted and in Security Breach. Other than that, they're kind of gone. Alright, so that's every reference to these guys that I can find. So let's mix our ingredients and see what kind of theories start to form. The most confusing part about them, in my opinion, is their purpose in the story, because that seems to change with every game and context within the same game. In FNAF 2, they both seem fairly aggressive. After all, they'll very rarely show up, but when they do, they just end your game straight out. But to be fair, neither of them have a jump scare, so it could be argued they're not actually killing the security guard, they're just ending the game. It's hard to tell. But then in FNAF 3, they're both helpful. They're guiding lost spirits or trying to take down William. In FNAF World, they're polar opposites. One of them is incredibly deadly, and the other is incredibly supportive. And then Shadow Bonnie turns around and becomes violent again in Special Delivery. On the surface, this is just nonsense. They keep flip-flopping what they're trying to do in each game. But I think that's because we're still on the surface. So let's try to figure out what they're made of and see if that illuminates any possible motivations for the actions they're taking. The biggest hint to what they're made of, in my opinion, comes from Special Delivery. After all, the more Remnant you collect, the more you summon Dark Remnant, and the more Dark Remnant you collect, Shadow Bonnie will appear. This and their similar color scheme seems to imply that either Shadow Bonnie is made up of, or has some domain over this Dark Remnant. What is Dark Remnant? Well, it's hard to tell in just the games. However, one of the books goes into the fact that this is sort of the yin to Remnant's yang. If Remnant is a manifestation of positive emotions and soul, Dark Remnant is the opposite, the negative emotions. In this way, it's actually extremely similar to Agony from the books. Let me take a step back. In the FNAF franchise, it's fairly established and accepted that when you die, your soul can attach itself to an object. We see this with every game, haunted animatronics. That's what's happening. However, in the games and the books, some people experimented on these objects, melting them down into a silvery substance that William Afton coined as Remnant. In the games, this is like a silvery metallic liquid that's kept in a dormant state due to heat, but with specific tools, it can be injected into animatronics or people to inject that soul into that animatronic or person. And apparently it seems that when Remnant forms, so does its counterpart, Dark Remnant. In Special Delivery in the books, Remnant seems to take this floating, shining form. However, in the books, it goes into more detail into what Dark Remnant could be, calling it Agony. Agony in the books is described as the strongest human emotion, and if felt in great enough magnitude upon death, it can possess things just like Remnant, or at least take on the shape of certain things. It's an incredibly important aspect to certain book characters like Eleanor. Granted, I haven't gotten to that part in the book yet, but I'm trying. I'm reading as fast as I can. So we're not going to go too deep into what the books say about Agony, but the basic concept of it does support the idea that Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie could be made up of this Agony or Dark Remnant, and honestly, I think that's the most likely scenario. Clearly, they're not possessed animatronics, there's no suit that looks like that. They seem to be spirits all their own that are incredibly visually similar to Dark Remnant. But if that's the case, then we'll need to figure out where did they come from, where did they go? Where did they come from, Freddy Shadow? If we are to assume that Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are made up of Dark Remnant, then we'll need to trace them back to an event that would create Remnant, and with it, its counterpart. Something painful, something tragic, and specifically, something that would have reason to form into the shapes of a Freddy animatronic and a Toy Bonnie animatronic. Granted, I say Toy Bonnie, but the model isn't exactly one-to-one. However, it's clear that in every iteration, Shadow Bonnie is much more visually similar to Toy Bonnie than any other version of Bonnie we've seen, except technically in the 8-bit Happiest Day minigame, but it is an 8-bit minigame, so it's kind of hard to get good representations within it. The first events that come to mind are the two instances where 5 children were killed at once at a Freddy Fazbear's, the missing child incident and the dead child incident. I mean, that is plenty of Remnant and Agony, and since they were killed at a Freddy's, those animatronics would be fresh on the mind. But one issue. Both of these creatures appeared during the gameplay of FNAF 2, and it's very likely that the dead child incident occurred after the gameplay of FNAF 2. So that incident couldn't have spawned either of these creatures. So they could have both formed from the missing child incident, but then why did it form into 2 creatures? This seems loose, so let's go over some other candidates before we lock this in. What other candidates do we have? Well, we have a speculative one from the tapes of FNAF 3. In them, they mentioned that the springlock suits are decommissioned due to multiple simultaneous springlock failures. Now, you could argue that this is the Bite of 83 they're talking about, but one, they mentioned multiple simultaneous, and I would argue that this is just one, but also, this might not even be a springlock failure. After all, when the springlocks fail, they snap shut into animatronic mode, and when this kid's head is put in the mouth of an animatronic, it's already in animatronic mode. so a spring lock failure shouldn't technically cause a bite down. It's more likely just either a mechanical issue or the animatronic functioning as normally, not expecting there to be a kid's head in there. So we could infer that these multiple simultaneous spring lock failures are employees being inside the suits, both being crushed, similar to how William Afton dies and eventually becomes Springtrap. This would be why the suits were put away for safety concerns. And if the only spring lock suits we know about are Fredbear and Spring Bonnie, that's pretty good. Granted, it's Toy Bonnie, but still, it's a Bonnie. It seems like a slam dunk. One Freddy, one Bonnie, and they die in a horribly agonizing, horrific fashion. Boom, agony creatures. But I do have one big issue with this theory. It doesn't explain their aggressiveness. Granted, we don't really know how agony functions, so maybe agony is just naturally aggressive. But Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie seem hell-bent on doing specific tasks that random employees that died from a workplace accident wouldn't know about or care about. Why would they be trying to stop William or help children move on? They're just employees that got caught up in a terrible situation. Sure, they could have stuck around and saw things happen and then choose to intervene, but why would they have stuck around in the first place if it was just a terrible accident? And they wouldn't have known about the missing child incident before their deaths, because as we hear from the FNAF 3 tapes, the missing child incident happens after this, because the warning to not use the Spring Bonnie suit is made in the same tape as the warning to not take people into the back room. Well, do we have any other potential characters? There is one that I hear a lot in the community that I personally don't like. Some people argue that these shadow creatures are manifestations of William's wickedness, specifically Shadow Freddy. Essentially, William's terribleness as a person and his pain and agony and death as Springtrap formed into a creature. Thematically, that's cool and all, but I think this is kind of technically impossible. First off, we see Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie in the FNAF 2 gameplay, which pretty arguably happens before William gets Springtrapped. But even more solidly, we see Shadow Freddy directly before William gets springlocked, so we know it exists before he dies. But even if these creatures somehow do spawn from William's wickedness, why would Shadow Bonnie then go on to give a cake to a crying child? None of this adds up to William in any way. I don't think this is possible. We have a few possible candidates, so let's try to mix that with some actions that they take and see if we can deduce a motive. In FNAF 2, both Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie are aggressive towards a night shift security guard. In FNAF 3, Shadow Freddy attempts to lead the FNAF 1 animatronics to go hunt after William Afton, eventually leading to him getting springlocked. And Shadow Bonnie is attempting to help the crying child move on. In FNAF World, they're both there to help the plot, but Shadow Freddy is aggressive and Shadow Bonnie is supportive. In Special Delivery, Shadow Bonnie attacks the player if they try to collect Remnant. And technically, Shadow Bonnie shows up in Ultimate Custom Night, but everything in there is created by the Vengeful Spirit, so it's hard to argue if Shadow Bonnie is there at all. Then, the candidates we have for either creature are either adult employees who died in springlock suits, or the children from the missing children incident. One is agony born of the pain of dying in a springlock suit, and the other is the agony of being killed by William Afton. I'm not sure if a workplace accident could cause the type of dark remnant necessary to create these two beings. So the question becomes, if the only candidate we have is the missing child incident, why are there two creatures? I guess that means that it's not all of them, but specifically two children that were killed by William Afton. Well, what two souls are strong enough, or which two children had such strong agony to form Shadow Freddy and then Shadow Bonnie? Especially two very distinct spirits. Freddy is out to get William, and Bonnie is just trying to protect the children. In fact, it actually reflects two spirits we know about in canon. Two very strong spirits that are already players in the story, Charlie and Cassidy. Cassidy is, as far as we can tell, the Vengeful Spirit, a victim of the missing child incident shoved into the Golden Freddy suit, who's vowed to follow William as long as he survives. Charlie, on the other hand, arguably William's first victim, is just trying to make sure that other children aren't lost or stuck like she is. She guides them to the suits so they're not lost. She helps them move on when she can. Shadow Freddy and Shadow Bonnie almost seem like a dark reflection of Cassidy and Charlie's role within the franchise. They're more aggressive for sure, but they still have the same goals. Stop Afton, save children. I think we're onto something, but what would this mean? Well, let's pop our mixture into the oven and see what kind of horrors rise. In William's many crimes, some consequences go unforeseen. One such consequence is agony. As William killed children, either to collect their remnant or just for revenge, he formed another entity entirely. Unbeknownst to him, two children spawned other creatures upon their deaths. Their souls went on to possess animatronics, but their agony lived on. When Charlotte was killed, She possessed the marionette, and then went on to help the other children that William victimized, giving them another shot at life, helping them to move on in death. But her pain formed something different altogether. Shadow Bonnie, another entity that at its core wants to help children, but more aggressively. If it suspected someone wanted to hurt children or gather Remnant, Shadow Bonnie put a stop to it. An aggressive foe to be sure, but still a guardian, nothing like its counterpart. When William killed Cassidy, he wasn't aware that he was creating his undoing. Cassidy's soul went on to possess Golden Freddy and become the vengeful spirit, haunting Afton's in any way she could. But her pain also formed into itself. Shadow Freddy, an aggressive entity obsessed with the end of William Afton. It's due to Shadow Freddy that William gets spring-locked in the first place, and even after, it remained with William, just lingering, making sure that Springtrap stayed down. Ultimate Custom Night is the true showcase of this duality. Cassidy, the vengeful spirit, is the one pulling the strings. She creates the torment around William, keeping him in an eternal purgatory. But Cassidy's agony, Shadow Freddy, is the one that you should not have killed. Cassidy is the mastermind, her agony, the aggressor. Charlotte is the shepherd, and her agony, the protector. Honestly, I think that's the strongest argument we have for the identity of these two very confusing figures. You could even extrapolate that since agony creatures seem to be able to change their shape, Nightmarion and Nightmare could be extensions of Charlotte and Charlie as well, but that's kind of stretching thin. One of the more cryptic parts of FNAF, the Happiest Day minigames from FNAF 3, have been mostly understood for a while. Charlotte, with the possible assistance of other souls, is giving cake to various crying children throughout these arcade minigames, all in the hopes that they can finally move on. Fairly straightforward.
On the crying child's page in the Encyclopedia, he is not listed as appearing in FNAF 3.
Wait, no. That has to be a misprint because... But no, that can't be. That's not. Oh, but what about no? That's not. Because what about? We could do the
gray crying child.
All right, slices, put on your aprons. We need to make ourselves a theory here. First, let's gather our ingredients. We got to reevaluate everything we know about Happiest Day, so let's take it from the top. Right away, you have access to most of the mini-games, but they're hidden and there isn't much to do in them. To make any progress, you need to break out of BB's Air Adventure, go past these shadow balloon boys, and collect this rainbow glowing balloon. Once you've done that, in Mangle's quest, you can break out, go past this shadow puppet, climb the balloons, and collect a piece of cake. Once you've done that, we're in business. In BB's Air Adventure, Chica's Party, Stage 01, and RxQ's level, you glitch out of bounds, find a crying child, give them a piece of cake. If you do all of this and access the Happiest Day minigame, we see a spirit with a puppet mask walk by several children celebrating with odd masks. At the end of the room, you'll see 4 crying children, all with a different FNAF 1 animatronic mask and 1 crying child on the right. We place a cake on the table, the crying child puts on presumably a Golden Freddy mask, the masks fall, and the balloons float up to the ceiling. Now, for a while, we all assumed that this meant all of these spirits moved on, after all the masks fall and the balloons float up into the air. That's pretty clear symbolism, but the book notes that Charlie can sense Afton is still around and chooses to stay, so we can't assume any of them left here. So we know at least that Charlie stays, which leads me to believe that the Happiest Day has already happened in the timeline, at least before FNAF 6, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's mix our ingredients and see what kind of theories start to form. Straight away, one of the biggest points that makes me want to revisit these games are these 2 characters receiving real canon names, Shadow Balloon Boy and Shadow Puppet, in the character Encyclopedia. And before anyone gets up in arms here, I'm not making a whole theory just based on this book. I recognize that there are some issues with it, but I do want to point out that I think this book is most useful in figuring out what we should look at next. Essentially, taking a look at this, and whenever it makes us question something, just double check, see if there's something we missed. And that's what I'm doing in today's video. In this case, I think the book is telling us, hey, double check Happiest Day. Do you really know what's going on? It names 2 previously unnamed set pieces and points out that maybe some people could stay after the balloon moving on scene. So back to these guys. Actually, one more. This book mentions these 2 by name, so I think we can officially name this thing Shadow Cupcake. It appears in Chica's Party, and I mean, if these 2 guys get a name, why not Cupcake? Immediately, this naming convention jumps to the front of my mind, because there's only one other character in the franchise with a naming convention of Shadow Freddy. This figure in the actual world of FNAF, who I speculate to be the agony-fueled reflection of Cassidy. Regardless, Shadow Freddy can often be seen paired with RWQ, as they're both mysterious, very rare creatures with a similar visual design. I mean, RWQ is part of the Happiest Day minigame. Why is this important? Well, between RWQ's appearance and special delivery and the direct call-out of Dark Remnant in the character Encyclopedia, I think it's pretty safe to assume that RWQ is a creature made of Dark Remnant, the game timeline equivalent to Agony from the books. This is bolstered from the parallels we see in the story Hide and Seek from the Fazbear Frights novels. What is Dark Remnant? We'll get into that, trust me, but stick with me for a second. If RWQ and Shadow Freddy are so similar, and we suspect that RWQ is made of Dark Remnant, then we could also speculate that Shadow Freddy is the same. All this to say, it's possible that the term Shadow and this visual design denotes a creature made of Dark Remnant, especially if those creatures exhibit similar characteristics and do similar actions to Shadow Freddy and RWQ. So I think it's safe to assume that all three of these shadow creatures from the Happiest Day minigames, and possibly the areas in which they reside, are either made up of or heavily influenced by Dark Remnant. Alright, I hear you. This is great and all right, but why should I care? These are just characters within an in-universe arcade game. Well, my question to you would be, are they? Like FNAF pointed out in his follow-up video, these 8-bit minigames have been used to show real-life things that happened, but in a gamified way.
And in Sister Location, Elizabeth doesn't canonically die outside. The minigame is just meant to be metaphorical and progress the story.
So if we extend that logic to these games, what do we get? Well, we'll have to break them down into representations of what they're trying to tell us. So put on your hazmat suits, we're getting very abstract and very speculative. When we, as the player, give cake to a crying child, what does that represent? What is it saying? Look at these games thematically. The main three have a brightly colored upper area above a monochrome darker area. The darker area being inhabited by these shadow creatures made of Dark Remnant. To me, this seems like an analogy of the conscious mind. The conscious upper thinking area and the subconscious lower area. It could even be a metaphor for an afterlife, but it's a little too loose of an interpretation. Is there anything within FNAF that we can use to anchor an idea of an afterlife? Or at least any example we see within the games? Yeah, two things. FNAF World and Ultimate Custom Night. Although we have no idea how, we're almost certain that Cassidy, or to be more correct, specifically the one you should not have killed, was able to create this hellish purgatory to torture William as long as they possibly can. So we know that for some reason, spirits in this universe can create essentially a purgatory for other spirits, or at least manipulate this otherworldly space to dwell within it. It's weird, but it's what the game presents to us. But FNAF World shows us that not only is this not special to the one you should not have killed, it's also not the only purpose to create one of these spaces. FNAF World tells us that it's a special place, but something outside has affected the inside, and now we as the player have to leave breadcrumbs to help someone move on. In it, we travel through this bright, colorful world and occasionally dip down into this monochrome, darker area. Not only does this nearly match one-to-one with Happiest Day from FNAF 3, but the things you do in this monochrome world directly reference the way you access the Happiest Day minigames within FNAF 3. Now, this isn't the first time that I've drawn this parallel, but in hindsight, I think my last interpretation was wrong. Previously, I speculated that FNAF World and FNAF 3's Happiest Day are two ways of telling the same story. In essence, it was just a retelling on how Charlotte helps the crying child to move on. But there's two problems with this. First, if FNAF World is just a retelling of helping the crying child to move on, what about the other 4 kids? And second, the character Encyclopedia doesn't even say the crying child exists in FNAF 3. So why are these two games connected? Well, I think it's because it's showing us what Charlotte does to help souls move on, because she does this not only in the Happiest Day, but again in FNAF World. We've been in the thick of the astrophysical talk for a bit now, so let's try to anchor ourselves back to something physical in FNAF. Try to bring in some evidence so we don't lose ourselves here. Remnant is a bit of a hot button topic within FNAF, but for the most part, a good chunk of the community can agree that it has something to do with the soul. And in the Ultimate Guidebook, we get a bit more information about this elusive substance. Quote, if Remnant is a conductor of emotion, it's possible that bright Remnant forms from positive emotions, while shadowy Remnant is formed from negative ones. Shout out DJ Aiden / Convenient Lamp for that picture. Okay, that tracks with what we know about shadow animatronics so far, but we're still missing something. Go back to Ultimate Custom Night. We know that the one you should not have killed is creating this purgatory to torture William, but how exactly are they doing that? We get hints to it via some death quotes in the game.
I am remade. but not by you, by the one you should not have killed.
These are things that Afton created, creations of his own mind, things that the one you should not have killed shouldn't know about. Somehow, the one you should not have killed is using the memory of things that they themselves were not there for to torture William with. Things only William would know about. Does this mean that the one you should not have killed is using William's memories against him? Okay, we're starting to get somewhere. We've established that it is possible in this franchise for a spirit to A, seek out the memory of another spirit, B, manipulate or even create little pockets of the space in between life and death, and C, that Remnant can exist in two halves, light Remnant and dark Remnant, positive and negative. Now we look back to Happiest Day. Now these abstract representations can be given weight. What do all these minigames have in common? There's scenes of a fun day at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and in each of these, we find a monochrome child crying, and we give them a colorful piece of cake, a happy memory. And it's then that they open their eyes. I think we've nearly cracked this thing. The only question left really is, who are these kids? Realistically, we have two options. It's either the missing child incident victims or the dead child incident victims. So personally, I'm a believer of Molten MCI. Essentially, the missing children incident souls were used to fuel the funtime animatronics during experiments. The funtime animatronics then form into Ennard, Ennard splits off into Scrap Baby and Molten Freddy, and now all the missing child souls reside within Molten Freddy. The problem with this theory is no one really agrees on how the missing child incident kids end up in the fun times. I went into this at the end of my last video, so I'm not going to go too far into it right now, but essentially my idea is that since FNAF 2 really establishes that pieces of the original animatronics are used to create and repair the toy animatronics, in doing that, part of the soul of the missing child incident kids ends up in the toy animatronics. Then in the end of FNAF 2, when we hear that the toys are scrapped, William just goes dumpster diving for some Remnant, bada bing bada boom, soul energy in the fun times. But part of the soul is left in the originals. That's how the missing child incident kids can essentially be in two places at once. Half remained in the withered animatronics, and half were in the toys. This is also to say I don't think the second batch of children that William murdered actually went on to possess anything. I think they just moved on. So our only option for the Happiest Day are the missing child incident kids, right? Well, literally, half right. As we know, the funtime experiments didn't work as intended. This is why I think the Follow Me minigames happens. William realizes he needs more of the pieces of the souls that he's experimenting on. He goes back for the FNAF 1 animatronics. But remember, the puppet guided the souls into these suits to give them life. This is all they've known for years. When they were dismantled, they were left with nothing. To quote Henry,
"And he robbed them of the only thing that they had, again."
They were possibly left in a terrible state, lost and confused. I think during this process is when the Happiest Day happens. All right, I think we've got it. Let's pop our mixture into the oven and see what kind of horrors rise. William needs more Remnant to continue his experiments. The excess soul he gained from the scrapped toy animatronics wasn't sufficient. But lucky for him, a Freddy Fazbear Pizza using the original animatronics had just closed down. All he had to do was break in and dismantle them, and so he did. One by one, he lured the animatronics to the safe room that he knew they couldn't enter, and once they started glitching out, he pounced, taking them apart one by one. But what happened to the soul inside? What happens to what little consciousness you have left if you're suddenly ripped apart? These children, these victims, they fell into themselves. With all access to the outside world removed, they were lost inside, stuck in their worst memories, reliving their last moments, surrounded by their darkest emotions. In one order of events, it ends there. Afton gets his Remnant and leaves. But that's not how the story goes. Charlotte noticed this was happening again, and just like before, she would give life to those lost spirits. This time, instead of bringing them into physical form inside of the suits, she had to try another strategy, bringing them back to themselves with a happy memory, a memory of cake, of celebration, of their happiest day. Only by doing that is she able to salvage what's left of their lost souls. And once she had done it for all 5 of them, they were not only able to leave the suits, but the pizzeria and move on. Of course, not before some well-due revenge, but just to be sure that he stayed down, Charlotte and the soul possessing Golden Freddy stayed behind. I know that sounds a little fanfiction-y, but I think this is what Happiest Day is trying to represent. After all, this ending doesn't happen unless you achieve the happiest day. And why would this be any less possible than Charlotte literally using arcade games to achieve it? This has to be a link in some way, but hey, maybe I'm wrong. Once again, the books are coming in hot to solve lore that we just had no leads on. Last time it was Didophobia with FNAF 4, and now it's Alone Together with the MCI and how Charlotte works. Look, you know it's a wild theory because I stood up for it, alright? I think this will help me think better. So if you guys don't mind, I think I might record better like this, but we're gonna find out. We're experimenting together. I've never done this standing up. I'm usually just, I'm seated, but I cannot sit for this one. This one is crazy slices. Put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. Although these sections I'm still gonna be sitting down because honestly, I love pacing, but my green screen is way too small for me to pace in front of it successfully. So we'll start with what we already know from the games. FNAF 1 is pretty sparse on lore. I don't think Scott Cawthon imagined that this game would turn into a 9-year-plus franchise with a movie and book series when he was making it. Actually, it's not a thing. I know for a fact. In several interviews, he stated exactly that. But what little lore this game does have appears on the randomly spawning newspapers in the cameras. Those newspapers talk about an incident where 2 and then 3 more children go missing. A suspect was convicted, but the bodies are never found, so it's implied that whoever was convicted got away without any kind of punishment. We also get reports that the suits begin to smell rancid and eventually the restaurant closes. With later games and books, we've come to know this as the missing child incident, where William Afton kills 5 kids and stuffs their bodies into the animatronic suits to be able to hide the evidence. All of this happening at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Important note here, we're like 99% certain that this Freddy Fazbear's Pizza that it's talking about is an earlier version of the restaurant before the FNAF 2 location. That way the suits are already haunted to become the Wizards. It's also called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, but a different Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. But again, the animatronics are the same. This is where Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy get their original ghosts that possess them. So in order, it goes Missing Child Incident, or MCI, at a Freddy's location, then FNAF 2 happens, and then FNAF 1 happens presumably sometime after that. But the Wizards isn't all that FNAF 2 showed us, because the FNAF 2 minigames began to give us a small glimpse into how those suits became possessed in the first place. The Give Gifts, Give Life minigame shows the puppet giving 4 seemingly dead children all a gift, and then an animatronic mask. Once all 4 are put on, Golden Freddy jumpscare happens in the middle, with presumably a 5th dead child where it spawns. Now this is confirmed later in FNAF 6 to be the working of Charlotte Emily, the dead daughter of Henry Emily, the co-creator of Fazbear Entertainment. We get direct confirmation of this in his speech at the end of FNAF 6.
Not my daughter. I couldn't save you then, so let me save you now. It's time to rest, for you, and for those you have carried in your arms.
But we never really get how this works. The answer was always, she just knows how to do this and does it anyway. But I think that figuring out exactly what's going on here as she's shepherding these souls will not only help us figure out the MCI, but it might even help us solve some of the more cryptic parts of the lore. Specifically things like the Happiest Day, FNAF World, even Golden Freddy to an extent. And to figure this out, the new FNAF book slots perfectly into our evidence. The main chunk of what we'll be using for evidence today is one of the stories from the new book that just came out, is officially out, so I will be still careful about spoilers because like just came out, but I'm gonna be less careful about it. Tales from the Pizzaplex number 8, B72. Where the hell is my book? Hold on. B72, this one, the one with the dogs on it. There's dogs on the cover. Specifically, we're going to be talking about Alone Together. It's the second story in the book, and before we get too deep, you know it was coming. We gotta do everybody's favorite. Rye has to summarize a FNAF book because most of the fan base either cannot afford it, does not want to buy it, does not want to read it, or for any other valid reason cannot access the book. Time. Luckily, the summary will be very quick. Y'all ever see The Sixth Sense? It's that. Anyway, so moving on. No, okay, but for real, Alone Together follows this kid named Travis, right? Nobody likes him, relatable. But his classmates like straight up actually ignore him. Like nobody pays attention to this kid. His dad barely talks to him. Realistically, the only good conversation this kid gets in his life is when he talks to his grandmother occasionally when he's coming home from school. Partway through the story for his woodworking project, Travis wants to make a mechanical Turk. Now, if you don't know what that is, nobody does. The book had to explain it like 4 times. Essentially, it's this old cabinet that had a chessboard on top and a little automaton that would play chess for you. Now this is really old, and it's really old because it's not actually something that works. It was an illusion where someone would hide in a hidden alcove of the cabinet and play chess, but it was like a very early magic trick. Regardless, he thinks it's really cool and he wants to make one, with Sun being the little automaton that would play chess. He starts doing research on this, but he starts getting these weird like thoughts and memories that aren't his, and he gets confused, and there's like, he'll get deja vu for things that he hasn't done yet, and he gets this very tight pain in his chest kind of often. He asks his grandma about it, and she tells him that it's likely a ghost attached itself to him and needs help moving on. Now, Slices, this is the really important part of the story, so pay attention to this. His grandma gives us the steps of ghost possession as well as what it takes for a ghost to move on. The steps are as follows. 1. You start to have funny dreams and flashes of memories that are not yours. It's like they possess your thoughts when they're near. 2. You can feel chills or a tingle on your arm or back when they're around. 3. There could be sudden movements of objects or sounds out of the blue. 4. If they really attach themselves to you, sometimes you can hear thoughts in your head as if the ghost is talking to you. 5. And if you are really gifted, and this is pretty rare, you might even see the ghost with your own eyes. And like I said, that's not the only important thing we get here, because we also get how a ghost moves on in this universe. Quote, "Yep, if it is a ghost," she told him, "your ghost may have died at your school, Trav. He might need you to help find him so he can move on. He could be trapped in that thingamajig waiting to be discovered. Wouldn't that be something?" And before that, she goes more in depth with, "A woman who had died many years ago in my daddy's land, most ghosts linger around the place they died, especially if their remains are undiscovered. They travel around the places that are familiar to them." The rest of the story is Travis just trying to find the body of this ghost so the ghost will leave him alone, and spoiler alert, he finds his own body dried up and dead in that mechanical Turk. That's why his entire school, except for like one person, wouldn't talk to him or look at him. He literally wasn't visible. That's why his dad barely talked to him. He was mostly talking to himself in grief over Travis. The final important thing to note here is that when Travis does find his body, of course he's scared and confused at first, but then all of his memories come back and he feels finally at peace. He remembers how he died, he remembers what he's been doing, he remembers that his grandmother is also dead and that's why she can talk to him. For the first time in a long time, Travis is happy, and then the story ends. Yeah, I gotta be honest here, this story is not scary at all, but it is incredibly depressing. But I feel like some of you already see where I'm going to go with this, so there's no sense in beating around the bush here. I think this book tells us exactly how Charlotte Emily helped the MCI kids, even how she created the Happiest Day, and I think it settles a minor debate that I've seen going on in the fanbase. What does the puppet exactly do with the MCI kids? Alone Together's entire plot is a ghost needing to find its body to be able to find peace. Not necessarily move on, but at least rest. This story, in my opinion, makes it pretty clear what Charlie does as the puppet. I've seen some speculative debates on whether or not Charlie was actually the one to stuff the bodies into the animatronic suits, or if she just gave life to those animatronics. Because of this new book, I think that second one is much closer to the truth. I think Charlie was the one leading the spirits to find their bodies so they could find peace. Sure, we have to wonder why she's sticking around in the first place, but I think Travis's grandmother gives us the answer to this. She states, in a cryptic way as to not blow Travis's mind, that she had already found herself. In other words, she knows that she's dead and her body has been found. She simply remains in this world to be able to visit old friends and speak with Travis. So in this universe, it seems that ghosts can stay around, they just are more inclined to if their body remains unfound. So with all that in mind, let's paint a picture of what likely happened using this book. Then we'll circle back for FNAF World and Golden Freddy and all that stuff. Charlie is killed outside of a Freddy's location, the marionette shutting down on her because of the rain. She's left outside and in public, and because of that, she's found pretty much immediately. Her spirit can move on if she chooses, but she doesn't. She doesn't have to move on even though her body was found. And like the character Encyclopedia states, hold on. Yeah, it's been here the whole time. I don't know if y'all knew that. Charlotte's spirit lingers on as more spirits are still trapped inside metal prisons, and Afton is still present, which is why she is still active in Pizza Simulator inside of Lefty. If she senses that William Afton is still around and able to do stuff, then she will remain to try to stop him from doing stuff. Charlie tries to reach out to her father to no avail. For a long time, there's nothing she can do, until William starts killing again. This time he kills 5 children, and he stuffs their bodies into animatronic suits. This This way, even though he's convicted for the children going missing, the bodies are never found and he gets off scot-caught and free. But when those spirits start to materialize on the other side, they're lost and confused. They don't even realize they're dead, they're just wandering the pizza place as if it was any normal day. They're just a little ticked off that a lot of people don't seem to even recognize that they're there. Charlie is the one that helps them. Her giving gifts and giving life is leading those ghosts to find their own bodies in the animatronics. This not only gives them peace of mind, but allows them to start manipulating the animatronics in question, at least in some limited way. We see this process more thoroughly in the Happiest Day minigames. These minigames aren't literally happening, nor do I think that Charlie is manipulating an arcade game to get this accomplished. We're seeing a recreation through these minigames of Charlie going through the pizzeria and finding those lost souls, letting them know that in fact they're dead. And that's why everything doesn't make sense, and that's why everything's terrible. But she's able to lead them to their bodies, giving them their gift of life again. So if that's the case, what about the ending of Happiest Day where they move on? And that's the snag for now. Because if this cutscene is to be believed, once Happiest Day is done and they all move on, well, except for Charlie according to the character Encyclopedia like we've stated, do you see the issue? If Charlie leading the ghosts to the animatronics is what allows them to move on, how are they ever possessed for any stretch of time in order to attack Michael or William? How would they have any time to be the animatronics that we see in FNAF 1 and 2? And then later down the line in Sister Location in FNAF 6? Well, I think I have an answer for that, but it is messy. So let's talk about Golden Freddy. Golden Freddy is a lot of things, and confusing seems to be the main one. With the names we get from the security logbook and the characters we get in the Stitch Wraith Stingers from Fazbear Frights, I personally think that it's safe to assume that Golden Freddy is two spirits. Cassidy, the vengeful spirit, and the bite victim or the crying child, the kid we play as in FNAF 4, the youngest son of William Afton. The one thing that the book makes very clear is that ghosts have an incredibly difficult time moving on unless their body is found. That's something that can't easily happen for the bite victim. From the hospital equipment we see in FNAF 4, it's somewhat safe to assume that the bite didn't immediately kill him, but rather put him into a coma-like state for some time and then he dies. If that's true, his body wouldn't be hidden at the pizzeria. Rather, I think it would be hidden in this mound we see in Midnight Motorist somewhere in the woods. Still hidden, just somewhere else. Somewhere that I think Michael frequently visited due to his guilt for being basically someone who helped kill his brother. And that's what we're seeing in Midnight Motorist. Michael frequently breaking out of the house to go visit the bite victim's grave. Just like Charlotte's staying if William is still around, I think that the rest of the MCI kids also stick around for some time just to help the crying child move on. We kind of see this in the Happiest Day where it looks like they're all working together to help the crying child. I think this is what happens now. And I think it's even possible that Cassidy is able to rope Michael into helping them, which is where I think FNAF World comes in. I'm not kidding. Okay, bake with me here because I think I have the full story of the MCI kids, Charlotte, Michael Afton, and how they all help the crying child move on. We go back to Happiest Day, but we stop just short of it. Charlotte is able to help the missing child incident kids find their bodies and find peace, but she can't find the crying child's body anywhere. They search the pizzeria, but to no avail. The search goes on and on, but they just can't find him here. They've got no leads. No one really knew this kid anyway, and he can't remember anything about himself because he doesn't have his body. But just then, in this old, closed Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, a young man signs up to be a security guard, Michael Afton in FNAF 1. The bite victim recognizes him and tries to call out to him with "It's me." Michael sees this, but he's more taken aback and shocked than actually understanding what's going on. That's when Cassidy has the idea to reach out to Michael through his security logbook. She tries to keep jogging the bite victim's memory with Michael present, all conversing in this logbook. That's why the three voices are in this book. The red ink is Michael, the faded text is Cassidy, and the changed text as the crying child. She's trying to prod the bite victim using Michael, but Michael starts to catch on to what's happening. He might not fully understand yet, but he sees that weird things keep happening to his logbook. We even see this happen in the logbook where he starts responding to Cassidy himself, like when Cassidy asks, "Do you still have dreams?" and Michael draws Nightmare Fredbear. It's almost like Michael and Cassidy are working together to help the bite victim. Through this logbook and the nearby arcades, Michael is able to figure out that in order to move on, someone needs to find the bite victim's body. And that's a location he would know. He snuck off to go visit it all the time as a kid. That lump in the Midnight Motorist woods. He goes, he digs it up, and he finds him. His long-dead kid brother. After all, why else would the big lore finish of FNAF World be going into some secret part of the woods and the game suddenly ending? It's to mirror what Michael is doing in the real world to assist with this, going into some secret part of the woods and digging up his brother. And it's right then that I think the last scene of Happiest Day takes place. Cassidy is off doing Ultimate Custom Night, but those missing child incident kids and Charlotte are there to finally help the bite victim put on his mask and move on with the rest of them. Charlotte staying behind to make sure William stays down. We kind of went all over the place for that one, and I went all over the place as well. I kind of like pacing around for these, but I understand if it's a little distracting for you guys, and I'll never do it again if you hate it, but I kind of like it, so let me know. 5 years. Help Wanted 1 has been out for 5 years. And yet, literally this week, somebody found something that no one has noticed yet. And it's something that became the best evidence we've ever had for Molten MCI. But I hear you, Rye, back up. What the hell is Molten MCI and what does Help Wanted have to do with it? Well, that's what we're here to talk about today. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. First things first, what the hell is Molten MCI? Briefly, it's a term that refers to the theory that Molten Freddy from Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator fully contains the souls of all of the victims of the missing child incident, or the MCI, hence the name Molten MCI. Realistically, the only thing that Molten MCI needs to prove to be true is that the FNAF 1 animatronics end up within the fun times. Everything after that is pretty much universally agreed upon. We see that by the end of Sister Location, the fun times shed their exoskeleton shells and form into one conglomerate mass of endoskeleton and wires, Ennard. As Ennard, it seems as though Elizabeth Afton is its primary soul. After all, it's the only voice that talks to us during the secret boss fight at the end of the game. And then, in the lead up to Pizzeria Simulator, we got some meta text hints on the lore through the websites. Specifically, the Scott Games website and the FNAF World website, which seem to have a conversation with each other via the source code. I'll put the full conversation here, and I've talked about it at length before, but essentially it seems as though all the souls and Elizabeth Afton have formed into two separate sides. The souls within Ennard wanting to kick out Elizabeth Afton, or at least all the animatronics want to kick out Circus Baby, judging by the speech patterns like dummy and the way that the other one says we. The conversation resolves that the rest of Ennard is going to separate itself from Elizabeth Afton, and it's that splitting that we see the result of in Pizzeria Simulator. At the end of Sister Location, we have Ennard, but the beginning of Pizzeria Simulator, we have Scrap Baby and Molten Freddy. The idea being that Scrap Baby is Circus Baby after being ejected from Ennard and trying to remake herself. Like she said, she can put herself back together. And then Molten Freddy is whatever was left of Ennard after the cohesive unit of Elizabeth left. After all, if she was guiding and pretty much piloting Ennard, it seems as though she was the head honcho, or at least had the strongest willpower of the group. So, that all is pretty direct and damn near confirmed. Where Molten MCI comes into it is stating that after Elizabeth leaves Ennard, the rest of the souls that go into Molten Freddy are just the missing child incident victims, explaining why in the FNAF 6 Insanity ending, you get that shot of 6 gravestones, the missing child incident kids and Charlie, Elizabeth and Afton not being represented here. The question that Molten MCI has to answer for this theory to work though, is how did the missing child incident victims end up in the fun times? In Sister Location, we get a lot of talk about the scooper, and then we see it at the end when it kills Michael and allows Ennard to enter his body. In Sister Location, the scooper is primarily presented as something that can take the insides out of an animatronic and nothing else. But a blueprint you can find within Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator tells a different story. It's still able to inside out a motherfucker, but the primary function is Remnant injection. So, to catch folks up, we have to talk about Remnant. Remnant itself isn't necessarily a material, but rather the combination of material. The idea presented in the book books is that when a spirit possesses a metallic object, most often in this franchise, an animatronic, and you melt down that metal in a very careful way, the resulting spirit stays within that liquid metal. This mercury-adjacent substance is what's referred to as Remnant. Said Remnant can be injected into other metallic objects, again, most often an animatronic, to then transfer the soul into the new vessel. The problem is that Remnant functions differently depending on when it's brought up in the games or books. Sometimes it's just seen as an energy source or battery, and other times it's literally seen as rehousing a spirit. Regardless, to my knowledge, we only get one direct reference to Remnant in the entire game franchise, and that's this blueprint of the Scooper. And technically this blueprint of Molten Freddy, but I've heard online that it's actually in the code and not necessarily unlockable in-game. Regardless, at most two, definitely at least once. Essentially, the blueprints of the Scooper tell us that the primary objective of this machine is to scoop out an endoskeleton, inject it with Remnant, and then leave it be, either then to be put back into the animatronic or just to study it. Notably, it mentions that while Remnant is heated, there's no notable activity or movement. It then further speculates that while heating Remnant may cause it to lie dormant, overheating it might neutralize its effects permanently. The thinking goes that this line is what inspires Henry to create the FNAF 6 pizzeria simulator. After all, the plan was to melt everything so much he would permanently neutralize the Remnant inside them. It's also theorized that this note on line B is how Michael survives at the end of Sister Location. If there was a trace amount of Remnant left on the Scooper when it was used on Michael, this Remnant was probably scraped along his body. And while that might not necessarily cause him to be possessed, it might prompt the body to be able to be possessed by Michael. After all, it would leave metallic things for Michael to possess. Or it could also be leaning on one of the book explanations where Remnant is shown to in some way slowly heal whatever it is possessing. It's really unclear. The problem with Remnant is it's very muddy. It's one of those things that is used and referenced quite a lot in the books and sometimes in the games, but never once is it fully specified and explained. So it leaves its rules being somewhat interpretive and loosey-goosey. All this to say, if the Scooper was in Sister Location and its primary function is to inject Remnant, has it already been used on the Funtimes? And if so, was that Remnant sourced from the missing child incident victims? This is the crux of the Molten MCI theory. To be fair, there are a lot of good explanations for where this Remnant could come from outside of the missing child incident victims. After all, for example, the Sister Location Funtime animatronics are perfectly built to kidnap children, and they're sent on private parties all the time. So if there is Remnant in these animatronics, it could literally be the kids they kidnap at these parties. There's also the explanation that although the Scooper was built, it was never used as a Remnant injector before William died. He just didn't get the time to do it. For Molten MCI to work, William must have already collected the necessary pieces of the robots possessed by the missing child incident kids, melted them down into Remnant, and injected them into the Funtimes all before Sister Location happens. And just to make sure we're on the same page, when I say the animatronic the missing child incident kids are possessing, I mean the original Freddy's animatronics. Quick timeline recap. Freddy's opens, missing child incident happens, those kids get stuffed into the OG suits. The restaurant then later closes. Then the FNAF 2 location opens up with those withered original animatronics in the back. Then that closes. Then those original withered suits are refurbished and FNAF 1 happens. So I'm not saying the FNAF 1 animatronics were stuffed, but I'm saying those animatronics way back when were the ones that the missing child incident kids were possessing. Up until literally this week, we didn't have a lot of very strong evidence to suggest that the missing child incident kids were where the Remnant was sourced from. Granted, we did have some good evidence. For one, that grave shot I mentioned earlier is really solid evidence. Not to mention the parallels to the Silver Eyes is very solid evidence. But there wasn't really anything concrete within the game that really punched through a Molten MCI theory. It was more a logical theory, something that made logical sense if a bit lacking in evidence. It's something that I myself believed and still believe, although I explained it in a modified sort of way. Full video over there if you want the explanation. And I mostly stand by that theory. But of course, all of this is before what I said literally was found this week. So let's finally talk about what was found in Help Wanted. On February 6, a founding by Maxley on Discord started making the rounds on Twitter. At the end of Ennard Vent Repair, there's a scene a lot of us know well. We see a furnace, we turn it on, a fire starts, and we leave. That furnace has sister location robots scattered on top of it, but that makes sense. After all, Ennard is the one that's attacking us here. There's always been this weird mess in the furnace, but at this distance it didn't look important, and nobody had thought to go and check before. Well, Maxley did, and found that it wasn't just some random mess, it was a pile of Endo-01 endoskeletons. In fact, someone else on Twitter ripped that model out and separated it into 4 distinct piles of Endo-01 parts. All this to say, we are shown a furnace at the basement of sister location filled with the parts of 4 different Endo-01 endoskeletons. Why is this notable? Endo-01s are the endoskeletons used within the original suits for Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. If anything was possessed from Molten MCI, it would have been the Endo-01 endoskeletons. Help Wanted as a game was meant to clarify the lore moving forward. In my opinion, the main ethos of the game was that certain things from previous games might be slightly inaccurate, but whatever we present moving forward, trust that. And in that very same game, we are given the endoskeletons of FNAF 1 in a furnace in sister location, a furnace that would melt down those endoskeletons into Remnant. Now, before we go much further, I hear you. Right, there are 4 endoskeletons here, but the MCI had 5 victims. What's up? And that's a good point, but consider where the vengeful spirit ends up, the Golden Freddy suit. And the Golden Freddy suit has always had a weird relationship with endoskeletons. After all, it's a spring lock suit, so the endoskeleton would be fixed directly to the animatronic shell, because it gets held back by the springs. And every time we've seen Golden Freddy presented, it's looked like it's an empty suit, or rather, it's in a wearable mode. So showing an endoskeleton for the 5th spirit of the MCI doesn't quite line up. This honestly is some of the strongest evidence I've ever seen for a theory in Five Nights at Freddy's. But of course, I would be irresponsible to not mention the problems with Molten MCI even in lieu of this evidence. One of the major issues with Molten MCI is timing. In FNAF 3, specifically the Follow Me minigames, we see where most likely William got the animatronic parts to melt down for sister location. After all, he leads the FNAF 1 animatronics into a back room one by one and disassembles them when he gets there. The problem is the 5th minigame of this series shows William Afton dying in a back room. So logically, when you see this, it seems like the only time William got his hands on the animatronics to melt them down, he died, so he wouldn't have had time to turn them into Remnant and inject them. Now, there have been explanations for this situation. My personal one was my favorite, where the toys get involved. It's that video I talked about earlier. If you didn't watch the video, essentially, I argued that in FNAF 2, it's directly stated the withered animatronics are used for spare parts to repair the toys. So logically, I assumed that this was sort of a rudimentary attempt at Remnant injection. After all, if moving possessed metal from one metallic object to another can transfer that possession, wouldn't using spare parts from the withereds into the toys transfer some of that possession? Now, I'd never said it would go fully, and I explained this in here. Unfortunately, in Five Nights at Freddy's, there is a precedent for souls being split into 2 or more different versions of itself, especially when Remnant gets involved. So my thinking at the time was that at the end of FNAF 2, it said that the toys are going to be scrapped due to malfunctions, which would essentially leave them unguarded. William would be free to collect these thrown out animatronics, melt them down, and use them as Remnant for the fun times. But as we see, the fun times are very violent and erratic. They seem to be wild in their actions. So my explanation for this was that he took half of 5 souls, melted them into one material, and split them up into different animatronics. So the result was messy and animalistic. Then, thinking he needs more Remnant, he would go to get the original FNAF 1 animatronics. And then we see Follow Me, where he dies. I still think this is a very solid theory, but the main problem is that in Help Wanted, it's Endo-01 endoskeletons, not Endo-02, which is what's in the toys, so it goes against the evidence we saw today. If Help Wanted is telling us that the Remnant injected into the fun times specifically came from the OG animatronics, what other explanation is there? I'm gonna be super transparent here. This explanation I've never been fond of. It's like valid and logical, I just think it goes against the presentation of the minigame of Follow Me. Personally. Regardless, another major explanation I've seen for Molten MCI is that the Follow Me minigames do happen, they just don't all happen at the same time. Rather, it takes place over a stretch of time, where one by one, William Afton takes apart the FNAF 1 animatronics to use their metal for Remnant. And then there's some gap or time in between disassembling the last animatronic and going back. So the question is, why would he go back? Well, we do have an explanation for this in the book and movie. In both the Silver Eyes trilogy and the FNAF FNAF movie, it's implied that William is able to better control the spirits of the missing child incident when he's wearing the Spring Bonnie suit. And what do we see him going after in Night 5 of the Follow Me minigames? The Spring Bonnie suit. So the theory goes that William Afton would have gone to get the pieces of the FNAF 1 animatronics to melt them down for Remnant. However, when his experiments started being violent and erratic, he went back for the Spring Bonnie suit to try to combat this. But when he goes, he dies and is locked in the back room. This is a logical explanation, and I can't even say it's necessarily unlikely. The main reason I don't personally like it is, one, it seems weird to me that 4 of these minigames would happen close together and 1 would happen much later. And 2, it puts the souls in 2 different locations without a great explanation for it. If all of the Remnant is within the FNAF 1 animatronics and they've been taken to be melted down to Remnant, why are the spirits still here to trap and kill William Afton? Genuinely, why? That's my main holdup for this explanation. But to take a page out of my own book, Help Wanted, I believe, is telling us that the previous games in the franchise might not be 100% accurate. And this could be one of them. This could be Help Wanted telling us that, hey, Follow Me happened. William Afton did these things. But maybe not exactly as it was presented as we saw it in 2015? Before we do end though, I want to make one thing clear. In the title, I said, Help Wanted proves Molten MCI. And I have to do that because, it's good clickbait, where I'm using a clickbaity, exaggerated title, but it is what the video is about, and I'm arguing for that. But I don't really think this proves that Molten MCI is true. Very rarely, if I use proves, solves, debunks, or something like that in a title, do I legitimately mean that. I'm trying to say that it's a good argument for these things. I have to put it in the title because I gotta get you guys to click on it. That's just what the YouTube algorithm likes. Don't get me wrong, I think this is really, really solid evidence for Molten MCI. But to use a word like proves, or confirms, or debunks, you really need solid evidence in this franchise. We honestly need to be a little bit more careful with the language we use in writing theories and talking about them. When you say something is proven, you have to be able to, without a doubt, make sure that it is true with evidence. Very little in this entire franchise would I say is proven. I'm not saying that just because I don't think this evidence proves something, I think it's bad evidence or even unlikely. I think this evidence makes Molten MCI probably the most likely explanation for Ennard and Molten Freddy. But I just want to stress how few things in this franchise are fully confirmed. Not to tone police, obviously, who the fuck am I? Say what you want to say. But personally, in actual theories, I want to try to avoid words like confirm, debunk, prove, and the like. There are softer words I can use. Titles, though, they're not going to change. Five Nights at Freddy's is a series with admittedly very few known characters. There's the Aftons, the Emilys, and we know some of the names of William's victims, but that's pretty much it until Security Breach. And even then, we get 3 new named characters. It's because of this and other solid evidence that many people assume that we play as Michael Afton in pretty much every FNAF game. And that does make the most sense in my opinion. He is the main protagonist of the series, a tragic character with a knowable backstory that rises against the evil of his father, a tale as old as time. But what if I put forward that Michael wasn't the only protagonist? Instead, there's been someone lurking in the shadows since the beginning, hunting down William Afton, protecting the children at all costs, and sometimes even helping Michael Afton. Well, that's what we're here today to discuss. So slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. So who is this mystery person? Well, I believe it to be Charlotte Emily. And before we begin to speculate anything, we really should go over everything we definitively know about this person. Any canon information about Charlotte, which admittedly outside of FNAF 6 there isn't much. But that game does give us some information that we can work with to learn even more about her. So what do I mean by this? The first time Charlotte Emily is directly referenced in-game is Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator, or FNAF 6, where the unnamed man that communicates to us via cassette tapes mentions his daughter was killed by William Afton. Now we'll go into the books and what they tell us later on, but for the sake of clarity and so I don't sound like a robot, it's worthwhile to note that most people believe this pair of characters are named Henry Emily and Charlotte Emily respectively, based off of the characters from the books who share a similar role. Charlotte's name, or Charlie for short, as far as I'm aware, has never once been actually in any game. The characters in a few of the games, most of them actually, but as far as her name goes, it's never specified, outside of the novels. Henry is a bit loose, where You could speculate that the log titled HRY223 means Henry 2023, but it's unclear. But for ease, I'll be referring to her as Charlotte, Emily, or Charlie moving forward. Again, we don't get much information about Charlotte in this game, but we do get reiterations and confirmations of previous speculations of the character. This game confirms that she was the character killed in Give Cake to the Children outside of a Fazbear restaurant. And then we get the huge bombshell, and this is the main piece of information we get in FNAF 6, essentially confirming that Charlotte possesses the marionette after she dies. And while she is the marionette, she shepherds and helps the other lost souls in this franchise. So, although this game doesn't tell us too much directly about who Charlotte Emily is, telling us that she possesses the marionette allows us to then get more information about what she does if we look at what the puppet does throughout the rest of this franchise. So let's do that. Like I mentioned, Charlotte Emily is killed outside of a Fazbear restaurant that the security puppet was inside of. However, it's not definitive as to what Fazbear restaurant she was killed outside of. We don't know where the security puppet was originally slated to go. Some argue it has to be Freddy's because Fredbear's never had any signs of a marionette, so a puppet being inside Fredbear's doesn't make much sense, but that is speculation. Others argue that it has to be Fredbear's because the only meaningful shot we get inside the restaurant is a bear inside of a fairly sparse restaurant. The same basic layout we see in the daytime minigames of FNAF 4, which we know are at Fredbear's. And not to mention, in the books, Charlotte is kidnapped and killed within Fredbear's family diner. The book evidence is fairly solid, and I don't have a huge counter-argument against it. I do have a problem, however, with the layout design argument, being that this art style is intentionally simplistic. We get barely any details of the layout or look of the building with this shot. This looks like almost nothing, so I don't find it very compelling to say, oh, well, it looks like the same almost nothing as FNAF 4 and FNAF 6. In the same vein, should we presume that because of Foxy Go Go Go, the MCI actually happened between two rooms that have no exits? Now, I do personally lean for the location being Freddy's, mainly because I don't believe the puppet was at Fredbear's, but also I think it would make a lot of sense that she would remain at the place she was killed. And why does that matter for this argument? Because the next thing we know is that the marionette helped the kids from the missing child incident to possess the original animatronics. Henry implies this in FNAF 6, and we get further implications from Give Gifts, Give Life, a minigame where we play as the puppet and give animatronic masks and presents to dead kids. We also know for a fact that the missing child incident had to have taken place at Freddy's, not Fredbear's. Not only does it say this directly in FNAF 1, but every other iteration of the missing child incident in the books and the film take place at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. So if Charlotte was around to help the children possess the animatronics after the missing child incident, then she would have been at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. So if she died at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, it makes a lot more sense for the reason why she's still around. And again, the location of Charlotte Emily's death is not definitive or confirmed. I just personally think it's most likely to be at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. After all, you could always argue that the puppet was at Fredbear's and that's when Charlotte possessed it, but after Fredbear's shut down, the marionette was moved to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and that's where she encountered the missing child incident. That's perfectly valid. It's just not my personal preference. We also know that she was trying to stop William Afton during the dead child incident, or the FNAF 2 massacre. Essentially, FNAF 2 shows us a minigame called Save Them, where we are Freddy being led by the puppet, and there's several dead bodies strewn about the FNAF 2 location. Eventually, we encounter William Afton, who attacks us, and we get the text, "You can't." During that minigame, we're being led by the marionette, so ostensibly, Charlotte knew what was going on when William was killing the kids at FNAF 2 and tried her best to stop us. We also know that she was at FNAF 3, and while her motives are unclear, there's a pretty good speculation as to why. There are frames you can get in the cameras that show the marionette in this hallway, and specifically the marionette with a reflection in the puddle below, implying that she's not a phantom puppet like we see in The Office. Now, again, we don't know why Charlotte is here, but it's a pretty safe assumption that she's looking for William Afton, just like Michael is. In FNAF 2, we get these in-between night cutscenes of the FNAF 1 animatronics looking amongst themselves from the perspective of Freddy, and on one of the nights, the puppet is in our face for the entire night. Many people, myself included, believe these minigames are dreams that Michael Afton is having. However, as we'll get into later, it's been confirmed in the FNAF world, at least in the books, that when a spirit is trying to reach out to somebody, they often implant memories and mess with their dreams. So it's very possible, if not likely, that these dreams are being imparted onto Michael by one of the missing child incident kids, possibly Charlotte, or possibly even Gabriel, the boy who is suspected to be inside of Freddy. Honestly, that makes a lot of sense to be that spirit, considering the main mechanic in FNAF 2 is putting on a Freddy mask. I wonder if that's why Gabriel is reaching out, if he is the one that is. I never thought about that before. Finally, and what I believe to be the most interesting thing about the marionette, the ultimate custom night death lines. In UCN, when most animatronics kill you, you get a random of like 4 or 5 different quotes from that animatronic. And keep in mind, Ultimate Custom Night is ostensibly created by the vengeful spirit. It's not a real place, and these aren't real animatronics, so the death quotes are often just reflections of what the vengeful spirit is thinking. However, we know the vengeful spirit absolutely hates William Afton, and all of these death lines have some kind of vibe to them, which makes the marionette's voice lines very interesting.
The others are under my protection. The others are like animals, but I am very aware. I recognize you, but I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore. I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way.
I think the ones specifically of note are the ones where she has to protect the others, and that the others are like animals, but she is very aware. This could just be a reflection of her role throughout the series, spoken by the vengeful spirit. But this also could be telling us that the marionette in this circumstance isn't actually being created by the vengeful spirit, but is instead checking in on both of them. Is the marionette one of the few actual spirits in this area? Further backing this up are the other 2 death lines. I recognize you, but I'm not afraid of you, not anymore. And specifically, I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way. Again, the vengeful spirit definitely hates William Afton, so this voice line seems fairly merciful, something that Charlotte would be likely to say. But pay attention to that last bit, you need to stay out of my way. That would imply she's trying to actively do something during the time of Ultimate Custom Night, which again feels very present and in the moment, not something that the vengeful spirit would be saying to William Afton, especially not from the perspective of the vengeful spirit, because again, the whole reason Ultimate Custom Night is happening is to torture William, not to keep him out of the way. And that's pretty much everything we learn about the marionette and Charlotte in the games. So what do we know about her from the books? Well, honestly, for the purposes of this video, not much. Again, we do get her name and the name of her father in the books, which is incredibly important, but the entire Silver Eyes novel trilogy focuses on the story of Charlie growing up and eventually facing off and killing William Afton, losing her own life in the process. But again, that story focuses on the robotic recreation of Charlotte Emily made by Henry Emily after she's killed by William Afton, something that, as far as we're aware, has no evidence of happening inside the games. It's realistically a completely separate character, and what she does in the novel isn't necessarily helpful in knowing what she would do in the games. For example, in the novels, Charlotte loves robotics and is studying them at a collegiate level, which is really interesting now that she's following in Henry Emily's footsteps, but she's doing that in college, and in the games, she dies at like 5 years old or something. Ostensibly, all we know is that before she was killed, she was just a normal kid. So what other information can we add to the ingredient list of this theory? I think it's relevant to bring up some notes about Remnant, memories, and how they operate in the FNAF world. Mark doesn't though. Sticking with the Silver Eyes for the moment, in the 4th closet, the 3rd book, Remnant is of central focus. When the character Carlton has Remnant injected into his heart, he goes fully unconscious, but instead of dying, his unconscious mind enters this sort of transient spiritual state, and he's able to see a child from the missing child incident. In this room, there are also floating pieces of paper that turn out to be ripped up drawings, and he helps that child's spirit collect these pieces and put them together. Each time they put a picture together, one of the spirits from the missing child incident reappears. All of this seems to be implying that these scraps of drawings are pockets of Remnant that Carlton and the other spirits can visualize and see in this weird spiritual realm. And when they collect enough Remnant of one drawing or of the same kind, then that child is able to rematerialize in this spiritual space, getting some of their memories back in the process. And only when all of that Remnant is collected and sorted is Carlton able to show them that William Afton is the one who killed them, giving their memories back to them. Because before then, they couldn't even remember that they were dead. They were just playing at the pizza place with their friend Rabbit. Another story doubles down on this idea of memories and the afterlife. Alone Together, one of of the Tales in the Pizzaplex stories follows a boy named Travis trying to figure out why a ghost keeps haunting him to create this box, until eventually he finds out the ghost boy was him. It was his memories that he was reaching out to because he is dead. But once he finds his remains, all of his memories come flooding back to him, and he suddenly remembers that he is dead, he is a ghost, and the grandma who talked to him is also a ghost. And suddenly he feels much more at peace. The book itself explicitly states, quote, "Most ghosts linger around the place they died, especially if their remains are undiscovered. They travel around the places that are familiar to them," which feels like as explicit as this franchise ever gets for how ghosts and the missing child incident could work in this world. This would explain why the missing child incident spirits are so lost and wandering, but Charlotte isn't. Her body is discovered immediately. She was left in the street. So with all of this in mind, what does Charlotte do in the FNAF story? What makes me so certain that she is as much of a protagonist as Michael Afton? Well, let's pop our mixture into the oven and see what kind of horrors rise. For one reason or another, and I have my own thoughts on this, but it's not for today's theory, William Afton kills Charlotte Emily outside of a Fazbear restaurant. The security puppet meant to watch over the children arrives too late and she's already dead. But due to the rain, by the time it gets to her, it collapses onto her. It's in this moment where Charlotte possesses the marionette. And even though her body is found, she remains at the pizzeria out of fear and confusion. Alone Together never states that a ghost has to move on when their remains are found. It only specifies that it's difficult for a ghost to move on without it. After all, Travis's grandmother sticks around just to watch over Travis and watch her friends as they slowly join her. Charlotte most likely sticks around because she's just a kid. Sure, she might know that William Afton killed her, but from her perspective, she has no idea why her dad's friend would have done that to her, or what's going on now, and she probably just wants to see her father again. But as she remains at Freddy Fazbear's, something goes horribly wrong. One day, two children appear at the pizza place, but they're children that can see her. No one should be able to see or talk to her, but they do. She asks them if they've been killed as well, but they don't know what she's talking about. They're just here to play at Freddy's. So she worriedly keeps an eye on William Afton. Maybe he's doing it again. And sure enough, she sees him do it 3 more times to 3 more children, killing them and stuffing their bodies into animatronic suits. And soon after, 3 more spirits join them at the pizza place. Charlotte tries to break the news to these ghosts, but they're incredulous. Why would they be dead? They're playing at the pizza place. That doesn't make any sense. So she goes to prove it to them the only way she knows how, showing those spirits their remains in the animatronics. And once the kids see their own bodies, all of their memories come back. They know what's going on and what happened. But before they can do anything about it, Freddy Fazbear's closes down. A while after, the FNAF 2 location opens up. The original suits are old and smelly and stinky and not really good for, using at a kid's place. So they're only used for parts at this point for the new animatronics, the toys. But when those workers took pieces from the original suits to use to repair the toys, they fragmented the spirits bound to the animatronics. One by one, the clear identities of these spirits split apart, and all that were left were aggressive beasts. This is why the withered suits and the toys are so aggressive. Neither half are sure what's going on.
The others are like animals, but I am very aware.
Luckily, they're only aggressive towards adults, and the children seem fine, but not for long. William commits the dead child incident, or as I referred to it earlier, the FNAF 2 massacre. In the minigame Save Them, there are several dead children strewn about the FNAF 2 location, and William Afton is just killing children and leaving them in the rooms he killed them. Charlotte wants to stop him, but doesn't know how, and tries to get help from Freddy, but he's too fragmented. He's not sure what's going on, so Charlotte has to lead him to William, but when they both get there, it's ineffective, and William wins that fight. Luckily, since the bodies were left in the open, the children William killed move on, but the FNAF 2 location closes, and the toys are scrapped. Charlotte can't figure out where they've gone, and now half of these souls are just missing, but she at least remains with the original cast to try to snap them out of it. After all, the marionette isn't a toy, so she's able to remain with the original suits. But even with all of this effort, it's hard to get them to remember anything. With the toys gone, the pieces aren't in place anymore. Eventually, FNAF 1 opens up, and Charlotte is still trying to coax some kind of memory out of those children, but they just, again, mindlessly attack adults. They even lash out at Michael Afton, But Charlotte doesn't. She doesn't recognize him as a threat, and luckily, he's fired before he can disassemble any animatronics, so he doesn't become a threat. But then William shows up again. William, however, remembers what happened at the FNAF 2 location. It's why he's showing up again. Somehow those animatronics recognized him and tried to defend the children from him. You would want to study the animatronics this time, and he would need to blend in to do so. As much as he would prefer the old Spring Bonnie suit, it would need some serious renovation to be safe to get inside of. So for now, he goes to the back room and finds any other remaining animatronics, and finds his old purple Freddy suit. He puts it on, and he leads them into the same safe room, disassembling them one by one. Quick aside, I know the purple Freddy and Follow Me being William wearing a suit is a bit of a stretch, I get it. But I think this train of logic, paired with the Shadow Freddy suit from the film, and the mention in the same game, FNAF 3, of irrelevant costumes being used after the Springlock suits, and all the other examples we've had of different characters having animatronic suits in the books, I think it's plausible, okay? I get it, it's weird, I think it's plausible. Charlotte tries, but she's ultimately helpless to stop William. However, eventually the spirits stop William themselves, led by the vengeful spirit. Now that the suits had been broken and scattered apart in the same place, there wasn't anything to attach them or anchor them. And in that weird semi-transient state, they were able to focus enough to get William killed. And it's here we see the FNAF 3 Happiest Day minigame. Charlotte tries once again to reach out to these lost souls, and in this state, they don't have all of their memories, but they're at least able to be found, and Charlotte reminds them as much as she can about what happened, eventually leading to a time where they can all move on. However, just like the character Encyclopedia states, Charlotte recognizes that William is not gone yet, and she stays around to keep an eye on him. She continues to follow him even when he's taken and put into FNAF 3, trying anything to stop him, but is ultimately unsuccessful, and eventually she's captured by Lefty for the Freddy Fazbear Pizzeria Simulator. While there, her along with everyone else are burnt to the ground, and in that moment of fluidity and uncertainty, Charlotte once again goes for William. But once again, it's being handled by the vengeful spirit, but that is perfect.
I don't hate you, but you need to stay out of my way.
With William occupied, Charlotte realizes the rest of the souls of the missing child incident are here. The missing pieces have finally been found. Them, along with everyone else at this fire, need help moving on, and Charlotte's already done it before. So it's here where, with her previous experience and seeing what the vengeful spirit is able to create, she creates FNAF World, a little purgatory of her own, a place to help the wayward souls of the franchise find rest and move on. But as far as what happens to Charlotte after that, I'm saving that for a dedicated video of the FNAF 6 fire and its aftermath. So for now, what do you think of my interpretation of what Charlotte does in the FNAF timeline? At least the first half. I feel like even if you disagree with the majority of this, it's agreeable enough and logical enough that it's still a pretty valid timeline. And her being so involved in this franchise and trying to take down William, I think earns her the title of secret protagonist. But what do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.